now I'd like to invite Tim to come up. Tim's speaking to us tonight, and it's amazing how life happens when a full circle works in a locality, because Tim was at medical school with our eldest son Will, and they obviously went separate ways, and then they suddenly met up again at St Matt's in Plymouth at a Sunday service. So Tim now lives down the road in Mary Taylor, and Will lives back in Sussex. But Tim, we are very grateful you're here tonight, and we have some. We know you've got some wonderful news as well. So here we are.
Good evening, everyone. As Sue said, I'm Tim. I'm now very much local to here, having spent the last 15 years or so in London, so we moved down. And I just thought I'd tell you a quick story to start off with. A friend of mine, I used to do some sports coaching with in the summer, was a footballer, and he was in the Tottenham Hotspur Academy, so he was quite a good footballer. And his hero was Teddy Sheringham, who was a Spurs player at the time. And this chap, Steve, was playing with the academy. They were training, and the first team walked by. And this guy's quite a cheeky lad. And he went up to Terry, his hero, and said, "Teddy, show me your best trick." And Teddy turns around and goes, "All right, I'll show you mine if you show me yours." So Steve's there. He's got. I'd show you if I had a football, but there's quite a lot of stuff. He was there, so flicking it up, catching it on his neck, sort of all that sort of stuff. And he was there. You know, so quite a big crowd sort of gathered. And then when he'd finished his sort of showing off, Teddy goes, "Very impressive." And then sort of Steve's like, "Yes, you've got to tell me. You've got to show me your best trick." And he's really excited at this point. So Teddy picks up the football. He puts it down and he smashes it into the back of the goal as hard as he can from about this far out. And Teddy says, "If you can do that in front of 80,000 people, you'll be the first name on the team sheet every Saturday." And actually, I think that's very much sometimes how we can approach life. It's very easy to try and show off and try and overcomplicate stuff. And actually, life is very much about doing the basics and doing the basics really well. And I think often, as Christians, sometimes we can really overcomplicate how we interpret things, how we do things. And so I want to share a passage that we probably all know very well. I want to have a little think about what it means and how that might apply to us. So if I can make this work. Can someone press next on the laptop? There we go. So, verse in Romans, I'm sure we all know very well. It says, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." Now, I occasionally paid attention at school, and I know that you shouldn't start a sentence with the word "therefore." It sort of implies that you've missed a bit at the beginning. So that's the first problem I have with this verse. Or I don't need that slide just yet. Go back. The second problem I have is that sacrifices aren't living, they're dead. You've given it up. And so the whole concept of a living sacrifice in biblical times is a really, really unusual thing to say. And so what's the context of this verse? What goes before it? And that's in the first 11 chapters of Romans. Paul's talking about the Christian faith and giving a really good overview of how you get to this point in history. So I thought we'd start right at the beginning with the next slide. So, the Bible's quite a long book, so if we do it line by line, we should be out of here sometime before next July, I think. So, beginning of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God made it all. And actually, it doesn't go into a lot of detail at this point. He just made it. And actually, if you notice, the next thing he does is create light and dark. So God made everything we can see in the dark. And that's quite a strange thing to get your head around, because I'd have gone, okay, right, let's turn the light on and let's see, let's do a bit here and a bit here. But he's just gone, bang, it's all there. And he's done it in the dark. And actually, if you go through the first chapter of Genesis, creation gets better and better and better and better with everything that God makes. And everything he makes, and yes, it's good, yes, it's good, yes, it's good. And then right at the pinnacle of creation, right when God's done absolutely everything, the final finishing touch of creation is to make man and woman in his own image. He was on his absolute top form, and mankind is right at the pinnacle of creation. And he placed us, he placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and to look after his world. In one of the translations of Genesis, it says to cultivate and keep. And actually that's the whole purpose of our existence, is to look after the world that God has given us and to live in relationship with him. Then, and this was all before the fall, because then in the third chapter of Genesis, we decided that we didn't really want to live under God's rule, and we started doing it our way, not his. And the Bible's very clear on this, that the penalty for this is death and the eternal separation from God, and absolutely not where God wanted us to be. But because God is who he is, he didn't want to leave it that way. And so along comes the New Testament, along comes Jesus, who's sent to take that punishment for us, to die in our place, so that because of that, we can then be in a right relationship with God. And that is what the passage refers to. That's the bit that goes before the therefore. That's the thing that Paul is telling us to respond to. And this lens of Romans allows us to view life and the world as God does. And when we see it how God does, our only response is to give everything back to him and to worship him. It's a bit like I remember getting my first pair of glasses. At the age of 10, I was getting headaches, I couldn't see things in school, and actually I got these glasses and everything became suddenly really clear. And then I started playing rugby and I was a bit rubbish at it, I couldn't catch anything, I couldn't really see anything. Then they invented contact lenses, and suddenly I was still just as bad at rugby as I was before, but at least I had half a chance of seeing what I was doing. And actually it's a bit like putting our contact lenses in rather than taking our glasses on and off. Do we just put our glasses on a Sunday and worship God, or are we seeing the world through God's eyes through the entire working week, rather than just what we do in church or here on a Wednesday evening? And when we see the world in this way, it puts everything into context, both good and bad. So if we go to the next slide, please, and the next one. So I last stood up here just over 2 years ago, and I talked about my youngest daughter. In December of 2016, this is Philly. Top left-hand corner was where she was on about the 16th of December, 2.5 years ago. She was very ill. She was taken to hospital. We didn't quite know what was wrong with her, but to cut a sort of very long week short, she was diagnosed with leukemia. And actually some of these pictures show some of the things she's been through. So the one where she's holding a toy duck was just before she went to theatre to have a line put in. The duck's also got a line in, and that was there to show what to do. Then the third one is her sort of walking around in the Marsden in London with some quite nasty chemotherapy drugs going in. But actually you can see that even though she was on some fairly toxic drugs, even though she lost all of her hair, even though her life was turned upside down, you can see she's still got an incredibly cheeky smile and an incredible joy for life. And so many people have asked us, as we've come through this journey, how on earth have you coped? How on earth can you stay positive through all of this? And the absolute truth is, the real answer, I don't know. All we've done is we've put one foot in front of the other and just kept going throughout all that time. And actually, in the dark times, watching someone you love so much, watching someone who is only 3 suffer so much is horrible. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. I wouldn't want anyone to go through it. But the way to cope is to use this verse in Romans and actually to focus on God. Say, actually, I'm going to give all of this to you, and to surrender everything, our hopes, fears, expectations, successes, money, talent, you name it, it should all go back to God. We go from the next slide, please. And so this is her still enjoying things. She found at the Eden Project the Madagascar periwinkle, from which one of her sort of most effective drugs was made, and actually she now calls it her favourite flower. And actually it's a tiny weed that grows in Madagascar, and it saved her life. And this response to give it back to God doesn't belittle the trials that we go through. It doesn't mean that we ignore what we're facing, but it does acknowledge that God is so much bigger than anything we encounter. It means we have to let go of our fears, and in many ways that's so much harder than letting go of our successes. I've really learned actually letting go of the bad stuff is much harder than letting go of the good stuff. Letting go of what's going well is fine, but actually letting go of what you're really scared about. Letting go of what you're really worried about. Letting go of suffering. Letting go of wanting to sort of ask why and wanting to say, what on earth is going on is much harder to let go of. Let's go to the next slide. Next blank, good. Looking back over the last few years and recalling the difficult times, remembering the frustrations, the worry, the unspoken fear that the cancer would return. And we went through a month of her being ill again. In October, it really looked like it was coming back, but thankfully it hadn't. Waiting for the phone call with results, not knowing whether we'd have to drop everything and forgo any sorts of plans and rush into hospital as cancer continued to tear our family apart. The only constant we had in that situation was God. The only thing I had to cling on to was hope in him and to acknowledge his sovereignty in every situation. That nothing was beyond him. And I've got a difficult job. I've had to do some fairly challenging things at work. But that was by far the hardest thing I have ever had to do. Let's have the next slide, please. And so this is some sort of later photos. And you can see again that the top left-hand one, this one with all these beads on the bed, every time Philly went through something, a blood test, an x-ray, a procedure, some chemotherapy, she was given a bead from a charity called Beads of Courage. She's got over 1,500 of those beads from all the treatments she's had. And it's a very poignant reminder of what she's come through. And the top right is her. We went on holiday in April, and she met Princess Poppy from Trolls. And actually that film was very big when she was having her treatments, and actually that was one of the things that she really clung on to. And so for her to meet her hero, albeit someone wearing a massive suit rather than the famous footballer, was a really, really proud moment for her. So I think, this side of heaven, I may never understand why we had to go through the trials of having a child with cancer. Why we as a family were dragged through the mill and back again. But to be honest, I've stopped asking why. I think it's the wrong question. Once I've started to understand that it really is not the right question to ask. And I'm sure that there are many clergy, there are many theologians who will debate the big question of why from now until eternity, but it's not something I'm particularly interested in anymore. I think to ask why implies that somehow I need or I deserve an explanation. And asking why is, I feel, a very much an inward-looking question that actually stops me from surrendering the situation to God. It stops me from actually giving him control over everything that I'm going through. I think it stops me from the renewing of my mind, and it hinders worship, and it affects my relationship with our Father. Okay, next slide, please. So this is towards the end of her treatment. The bell that she's ringing is one that, when we were first diagnosed, I remember sitting in the room for parents, and I saw this bell. And this bell was one that you ring when you get to the end of your treatment. And 2 weeks before she finished her treatments, one of those was installed in Plymouth. And she was the first person ever to ring that bell. And that was such a proud moment. And actually to look back at those first few days when we're coming to terms with the diagnosis, and actually the point at which we'd get to the end of treatment seems so far off, and through many sort of setbacks it seemed to be going even further into the distance, was a lovely, lovely moment. And I've learned that I don't need all the answers. Sometimes heaven is silent, and we need to refocus ourselves on God and his ultimate sacrifice that brings us back to him. Let's go to the next slide. It should be blank. The purpose of our lives, as found in Genesis, is to worship God. But not just by singing songs here, not just by coming up with the latest version of What a Friend We Have in Jesus and singing it with lots of different instruments and in brilliant ways, but to be exactly who we were meant to be, which are people who are made by God in his own image and with whatever plans God has for each one of us. That is true worship, and that is the only response we can have to truly grasping what God has done for us. Paul Cowley, you may have heard of, he was speaking at HTB on Sunday, not HTB, at St Matt's on Sunday, he's from HTB, and he was saying that God chooses to use us all for his purposes. We don't always know why. He can do it himself, but actually he chooses to use us. And you can tell how much he values us, because actually if you don't do what God means you to do, if you don't do your bit, it might not get done. That's how much he values each one of us. But he can only use us when we fully surrender to him. This is what the passage means when it talks about a living sacrifice, which leads to renewing of your minds. Yes, we are saved through Christ, but our response to that is worship. It is to fully surrender to him, and only then can we fulfill our true potential as we were made by God. It's only then that we can see the extraordinary things that God can do, and we can't even conceive what he has in store for us. The last 2.5 years have been a really testing time, but I think I've grown more through that time than I have at any other time in my life. I'm going to show you one more picture, and that's this one. This is quite possibly my favourite photo. This is Philly at Focus a couple of years ago. She had no hair. She was in a horrible, horrible way. She was having some absolutely toxic drugs and her chemotherapy. We were camping, it was hot, it was a disaster. But here she is, in a tent, on my shoulders, with her hands up in the air, worshipping God. And if that doesn't live out this passage, I don't know what does. And so the only response to God's love is to worship him in all that we are, in all that we do. And to worship is to glorify God, not just, as I said, on a Sunday, not just on a Wednesday evening here, even in such lovely surroundings with such lovely weather outside, but in everything, at work, with our families, through the good times and the bad, looking at the world, looking at our lives through God's eyes, looking at how he made everything, looking at where he put us in creation, looking at how far we fell from him, and how far he came to bring us back again. There's only one response to that, and that is to get on your knees and to worship God. And it's at that point the ordinary becomes the extraordinary.